Hi, welcome everybody tuning in today. I'm Billy Mitchell, editor-in-chief of FedScoop, and I'm joined by Jim Richberg, the field CISO of Fortinet. We're wrapping up the Security and Transformation Summit 2020, and Jim, we wanted to talk a little bit about some of the themes of this year's summit. One of the big themes that is on everybody's mind, obviously, right now is the pandemic and the way it's impacted government organizations. So I want to tie that to cybersecurity and ask you, how has the pandemic impacted the way government must think about cybersecurity in today's landscape?
Well, thank you, Billy. It's good to be with you. To the extent that remote telework is going to be a part of the new normal for any agency, and the data suggests it's going to be a significant part for virtually all agencies, the weak link in that chain is the security of the remote teleworker's actual environment. We probably never had perfect visibility and control into what was going on in the office. We're all familiar with the problem of shadow IT, but the reality is federal agencies really don't know what's going on in that home user's environment, and even the employee doesn't if they have teenagers. So what we've got is we're hoping that we are able to isolate the workload for that government device from everything else that's going on that network. But that's a single point of failure. So virtually everyone has implemented VPN technology for that connection from the remote work site back to the enterprise or to the data center or to the cloud. But are you actually able to verify what you're bringing back? As a second check on the integrity of that remote environment, are you actually able to inspect this SSO encrypted traffic that you're bringing back? A lot of agencies turn out to have the capability in theory, but in that rush to implement the pivot to remote telework, they turned it off because that was a field expedient they had to do to get up and running with acceptable latency. Now it's time to go back and revisit that and say, what do we need to do going forward differently? And the second issue is I think agencies need to accelerate their pivot to implementation of zero trust network architecture. Security should no longer be defined based on where you're connecting from.
So even long before COVID-19 and the move to telework, you mentioned zero trust as one way that agencies are kind of modernizing and transforming their cybersecurity. So how, as agencies look to continue that transformation and that modernization of their cybersecurity, what elements are most important to their success in that journey?
Well, Billy, zero trust is something that's not just a buzzword. It really is something that the term doesn't help us. It's not that your users aren't trustworthy. It's that trust should be transactional. It gets beyond layered defense. It's a way of saying location should no longer be the key factor. Am I connecting from within the network perimeter or somewhere else? Privilege should be transactional. We should assume that the networks are compromised, and we should validate the users and the devices for each access and then for each application that you're going to be used. And I talk to agencies that say, oh, zero trust is really hard. I could never do that. And I go, well, gee, do you have network segmentation? Yes. Do you give everybody the same class of access, or do staff, employees, contractors, and visitors get different access? Yes. Do you have passwords? Yes. Well, congratulations, you're doing the elements of static zero trust. Now, if you want to make it dynamic and especially real time, that's increasingly challenging, but it's not mission impossible to do it. As a matter of fact, we've got managed service providers and systems integrators that are now talking about offering zero trust as a service, both to federal agencies and to their supporting contractors.
That's great. I'd like to ask you about, within these modern technologies, how do things like AI, obviously is one that's talked about a lot, how does that bolster cybersecurity in this landscape?
Billy, I think AI and its subset of machine learning are actually a key part of a fundamental transformation that I think is underway in the discipline of cybersecurity. And often we're so close to the trees that we don't step back and see that the forest itself is changing and even the lay of the land under it. I think there's an increasing intersection between these multi-vendor ecosystems of products and services that span the breadth of the attack surface. So they have commonality of ways of reporting data, commonality of controls. That intersects with AI and ML. That gives us the ability to generate threat intelligence at scale, and then to push out policy-driven automated action everywhere. so that an agency benefits not only from seeing what's hitting its own perimeter, but what's from hitting not only other federal agencies, but since these are globalized ecosystems, things that might be hitting elsewhere in the world, you benefit from being inoculated against in real time. So AI and ML is fundamentally powering a transformation in the power of cybersecurity that we too often fail to appreciate.
And Jim, as we close, you mentioned a little bit about zero trust earlier, not being just a buzzword, but something that a lot of agencies are already doing. So what makes it not just a buzzword, and what kind of gives it that staying power that makes you think it's going to be around to kind of last?
Well, you know, I think that zero trust is really just one of a number of things that are really transforming the way agencies need to think about cybersecurity. I mean, the key takeaway, Billy, is that there are viable and in many cases validated and increasingly mature solutions in the cybersecurity industry to virtually all of the problems that the federal government is grappling with. The federal government shouldn't think it needs to go off and invent a wheel. Their solutions are there. There are some challenges that the federal government has to deal with. One is visibility, and I don't mean visibility of what's going on the network, visibility of the broader landscape of cybersecurity. I talked about what AI and the intersection with platforms was powering. If you're looking at a specific individual procurement and the performance criteria for that, you might not step back and say, I should look at this in the broader context of this plus the next two procurements as well. Certification. Certification is really good and useful for the government. Certification takes time. Certification takes resources that the private sector is not always willing to put against something if they don't necessarily see that it's going to result in the business. In budgeting, the federal government has to upgrade and incrementally. They have a more protracted, prolonged cycle of doing this. And the other factor I would put in is that the federal government is good now at coming up with a strategy for cyber. They're not as good at the implementation of strategy. If I do this, then what am I going to do as the next step? So these are the challenges. I mean, what we really deal with in the federal government is the federated nature of trying to secure the federal enterprise. You want interoperability. You want a common operating picture, the holy grail we've been looking for 20 years. But you also don't want to straitjacket agencies to say one size fits all in the way they do it. So zero trust is one element of that where you say there are viable solutions. You need to figure out what ingredients will make the mix of the cybersecurity recipe that works for your agency.
Jim Richberg, thanks so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to talk about all of these cybersecurity issues on the federal landscape. So once again, thanks so much.
Thank you, Billy. It's a pleasure to be with you.